I want to start by telling you a story. This story is about a man called Jim Stockdale. Jim was an admiral in the Navy, and in 1965, his plane was shot down over North Vietnam. He was taken prisoner and held captive as a prisoner of war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton for 7.5 years. He underwent horrific torture. He had to do horrific things in order to survive. And when he came out of it, they asked him, what was the difference between the people who made it through and the ones who didn't? And more specifically, the ones who didn't make it through, what did those folks have in common? And he said, oh, that's easy. The ones who didn't make it through, those were the optimists. They were the ones who said, we'll be home by Christmas, and Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And they'd say, we'll be home by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go. And they'd say, we'll be home by Thanksgiving, by November, and November would come and go. And he said, Christmas would roll around again and they would die of a broken heart. He said, the ones that made it through were the ones who never confused total faith that they would prevail in the end, which is something you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of our current reality, no matter how difficult they may be. Total faith that we will prevail with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of our current reality. This became known as the Stockdale Box. To me, it's not a paradox at all. The only way that we can prevail in difficult times is by having the discipline to confront the brutal facts of our current reality. All right, hold on to that Stockdale paradox. Keep it in your mind. We're going to change direction slightly. I'm going to invite you to travel back in time with me. The year is 2012. Exxon is the most valuable company in the world. And I want you to imagine that you are the head of learning and development. And you're thinking about how best to develop your talent. What should you focus on? Got it? Got it in your head? Okay, hold that thought. Let's go back further, a lot further. Let's go back to what defines us, to when we first started to learn. And that's a long time ago because we are a learning species. We have been learning since we lived in caves. Learning is what allowed us to develop tools, to develop technology, to develop language, to tame fire. Learning is what allowed us to build the society that we have. Now, in the workplace, the first way that we learned was through apprenticeships, of course, and on-the-job training. Back in the day, we didn't have any kind of formal learning and development function. There were no evaluations. There were no credentials. There was no micro-learning. What changed all that was the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution came about, all of a sudden, we had machines, we had factories, we had whole industries, and we needed people to learn how to work in them. That was in the 1800s. And I want you to think about what the world looked like in the 1800s. For most of that century, there were no phones, not smartphones. There were no phones at all. There were no cars. The first factory school was established in 1872, 4 years before the first telephone call. That factory school trained machinists. There's a model I love that I'd love to share with you. It's called the Cynefin framework. And the Cynefin framework suggests that problems come in 4 flavors: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And at the time when the L&D function was emerging in that Industrial Revolution context, the problems it was designed to tackle came pretty much in the first 2 flavors: complex, simple, and complicated. Simple problems are problems that have typically one correct answer. And because of that, it's simple to train people to deal with a simple problem. They have to learn how to recognize the problem, categorize it into a known domain, and respond with a known solution. People working assembly lines are typically dealing with simple problems. You have to identify every blue widget that comes down the line and sort it into this bucket over here. Pretty much if you're doing a repetitive task, you're dealing with a simple problem. Now, I want to be clear that just because problems are simple doesn't mean they don't require skill. Sewing clothes, for example, requires quite a lot of skill, but if you're sewing the same kind of shirt over and over again, you're probably operating in a simple context. The second flavor of problems that learning and development evolved in to address was complicated problems. Complicated problems also typically have clear solutions, but those solutions require a fair bit of expertise. If your steam train broke down, you needed an expert to understand what was wrong, what was broken, and how to fix it. Today, a jet engine, for example, is complicated, has lots of parts, and needs lots of expertise. But if you had enough time and a good enough manual, you could figure out how to take it apart and put it back together again. The solutions are known. The learning and development function started booming with the First World War. Huge numbers of people needing to be trained to manufacture weapons. Consistent, repetitive, known solution, simple problem. Fast forward 50 years, McDonald's founded Hamburger University in 1961. What is McDonald's famous for? Doing things exactly the same way every time. Consistent, repetitive, known solution, a simple problem. And in those early days of L&D, what were we training leaders for? Complicated problems, specifically to maximize profit. Now, in the years and decades since then, the L&D function, as you well know, has gone through lots of iterations. We've seen e-learning, micro-credentials, individualized instruction, but mostly L&D is still focused on teaching specific knowledge to accomplish a specific task. And by definition, when we're talking about specific knowledge to accomplish a specific task, we're talking about problems that are either simple or complicated. But here's the thing. If we're only training people to know the answers that we already know, they will never learn how to find answers to the things we don't know. And here's the other thing. The answers we already know will almost certainly at some point become wrong. Today, we live in a world where robots and artificial intelligence are way better than humans at dealing with problems that are simple or complicated. So what's left for us, what's left for the humans, are the problems that are complex or even chaotic. So when a problem is complex, the solutions are beginning to emerge, but nobody knows what they are yet. We certainly don't know. Now, as Miriam said in the intro, for the past 5 years, I've been working with organizations to help them better understand the complexity of exponentially accelerating technologies and their impact on our organizations and on society. And I can tell you that almost all of the organizations I work with, even today, still don't appreciate the magnitude, the scope, and scale of the impact that exponential change is bringing our way. We're still responding too slowly. We're still not appreciating how dramatic the disruption is that is facing us. But we're not just facing technological change. We're facing economic change, political change, social change, climate change. And all of those vectors of change are converging to create a world that's even more complex. And then, of course, this year we have COVID. And thanks to the pandemic, we moved from complexity into chaos. And I bet when that happened, you had to come up with a whole lot of new solutions in order to make it through. In a world of complexity and chaos, relying on known solutions is a recipe for disaster. What we need when we're dealing with complexity and chaos are people who can adapt dynamically, who can transform their thinking and their understanding in real time. We need to move away from training people to understand the answer and towards training people to operate in spaces where there are no answers. We need to train people to create their own answers, which really means we have to transform our thinking about the purpose of learning and development. Now, 2 years ago, I had the incredible privilege of training with Dr. Brené Brown to facilitate the Dare to Lead curriculum. Dr. Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston, where she holds the Brené Brown Huffington Endowed Chair. And the Dare to Lead curriculum is based on a research project that began with asking 150 global C-suite executives a single question. What is the most single important characteristic for our leaders to have in the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond? These are CEOs, CIOs, CFOs of major multinationals such as Capgemini. What does the world need from our leaders? And the answer that came back was unequivocal, no close seconds. The single most important thing the world needs from our leaders is courage. So 3 things the research tells us about courage. Number 1, the single biggest indicator of a lack of courage in our organizations is an inability to have difficult conversations. And because we don't have difficult conversations, we don't deal with the reality of our problems, and they get worse and worse. Number 2, the single most accurate measure of courage is a willingness to lean into vulnerability. And the definition of vulnerability is risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. So I'm going to ask you to do something right now. I want you to bring to mind a time when you saw somebody doing something courageous. It can be somebody you know, somebody you don't know, something recent, something from a long time ago. Got your courageous moment in mind? Okay, now I want you to ask yourself, what role did vulnerability play in that moment? Was that person taking a risk? Were they facing uncertainty? Were they opening themselves up to emotional exposure? You cannot have courage without vulnerability, because without risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure, the thing you're doing doesn't require courage at all. And the third thing the research tells us about courage is the best news of all, which is that courage is contagious. And when you're brave, you give people around you permission to be brave, which is what we need, because it's scary to admit that we don't have answers. It's scary to face a world of complexity and chaos. It's scary to look our challenges square in the eye, take accountability for where we've gone wrong, and take action to fix things. But if we don't get real about the problems we're dealing with, we will never make it through. Let's go back to Exxon. Do you remember I asked you to think about where you thought you should focus in order to develop your talent? And I asked you to imagine that we were in 2012. That was 8 years ago, when they were the most valuable company in the world. Just a few months ago, Exxon was kicked off of the Dow Jones Industrial Average after 92 years in the index. Last month, they had to write off somewhere in the range of $17 to $20 billion worth of natural gas assets. The leaders of Exxon did exactly what Stockdale warned against. They made the all too common mistake of assuming the world would keep going as it was, that they could continue with known solutions to simple and complicated problems, that they didn't need the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of their current reality. And now they're paying the price for it. Now, Exxon isn't the only company that has to confront some difficult truths. According to the New York Times, the 500 biggest companies in the world are facing around $1 trillion in costs from climate change. According to McKinsey, 79% of CEOs are reevaluating their purpose as a result of COVID-19. And according to KPMG, 50% of the world economy will be affected by current automation technologies. And in the context of all of that complexity and chaos, I want us to imagine a new purpose for learning and development. What if our learning and development function equipped us to deal with complexity and chaos? What if learning and development supported people to understand their individual and collective responsibility to people, planet, and profit? What if L&D supported people to understand the shifting trajectories of what we value and how we value it, to question when we're going down the wrong path? What if learning and development was the key function driving organizations to be completely clear about their purpose and empowering employees to hold themselves and each other accountable for living up to it? What if L&D focused on skills that aren't readily automated? What if it was about growing people to be clear, confident, independent thinkers who understand how to assess a situation, analyze options, and make decisions with imperfect information? What if a key pillar of the L&D function was to ensure that people had the skills necessary to lean into tough conversations, to face inconvenient truths head on, to name the elephants in the room? What if the learning and development function was about growing cultures of courage? And most importantly, what if the L&D function shifted away from the question of what do we need to teach people and towards the much bigger collective question, how do we need to show up in the world, every one of us, in order to be able to tackle the massive and profound challenges that confront us? This is the kind of L&D our organizations need if we don't want to end up like Exxon. More importantly, this is the kind of L&D the world needs if we want to be able to truly tackle the complex challenges that we're facing and make the world a better place. But I have every confidence that we can do it. Thank you. The way to think about quality control is less about doing the same thing over and over again and more about understanding core principles. So we have to pull back from, in this context, we are always going to do this specific thing. This is the answer to this situation, and more about a collective understanding of how do we think about problems generally. What are the rules by which we develop our solutions? So for example, let's say a problem comes up. I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that in my organization, if I prioritize the customer and if I can demonstrate that I've thought through, 4 elements of the cost, the consequence, the connective tissue, and the context, then whatever answer I come up with, I will be supported by my organization. Right? So less about knowing the answer and more about the principles by which we develop our answers. If we can get really clear with that, then what we effectively can do is decentralize the way that we come up with answers to situations. To me, this is the question. Courageous, vulnerable leaders. That is exactly what the world needs. And obviously what the research showed us as well, not just my opinion. One of the wonderful things about the research is what we now know is that courage is not something that people are either born with or not. Courage actually comprises very specific skill sets that are teachable, measurable, and observable. And you mentioned that learning is all about developing skills. Developing those skills is a super high priority, certainly for every organization that I'm involved with. Those 4 skills, just so you know, are number 1, our ability to sit with and navigate vulnerability. And you'll recall from my talk, the definition of vulnerability, which is risk, uncertainty, emotional exposure. Number 2, our ability to turn our values from, words on a poster on the wall into tangible and practical behaviors that we can hold ourselves and each other to account for. Number 3, our ability to trust and be trustworthy. And the research has articulated 7 elements of trust that we can point to, again, hold people to account for, measure, observe. And then the 4th skill set of courage is what we call learning to rise. And that is basically understanding the physics of vulnerability. The physics of courage are such that if you are brave enough, often enough, at some point it's going to go terribly wrong. And having an organization that recognizes that when things go terribly wrong, that is not an indicator that we should pull back from courage. That is an indicator that we were being brave often enough and that we need to get up, dust ourselves off, and try again. One of the things is that in order to have to put into practice and have direct change on behaviors, the conversation about courage, the upskilling about courage, needs to be absolutely elevated in terms of its priorities for the not only for the L&D function, but across the organization, from the leadership level on down. One of the things that we do, so for example, at BOMA New Zealand, where I'm the chief executive, we've articulated a set of what we call behavioral aspirations. And those behavioral aspirations are extremely specific when we talk about courage behaviors. So for example, one of the things that it says in our behavioral aspirations is that we do not talk about each other behind each other's backs. And if I have an issue with you and I'm not talking to you directly about that issue, I am as accountable for the problem as you are. We further recognize that sometimes if you and I have an issue together, I might need some help in order to work through that issue so that I can, if I want to come and talk to you about it, I can come in well prepared and I've thought it through and I'm set up to have a constructive conversation with you. And so what our behavioral aspirations say is that if I go and talk to someone else about this issue that I'm having with you, what I can say is, hey, I'm having an issue with Vanessa and I need some help to think it through so that I can go and talk to Vanessa about it and get it resolved. So we're extremely specific about what's okay, what's not okay. We then build that into our performance reviews. We build it into our remuneration policy. Consistent disregard for those behaviors is a fireable offense. We take it extremely seriously that there is no room for people who are not going to show up with the kind of courage and commitment to the relationships we're trying to build. There's no room for that in our organization. So what it basically, the bottom line of what it comes down to is really escalating its priority, not only in terms of L&D, but in terms of how it flows through HR, through how we deal with the rest of the organization, and making sure we're modeling it from the top every single day. I would say my biggest lesson in resilience this year, sometimes there are these lessons, I think we all have them, that it's like we have to get hit with them 500 times before they stick. For me, the lesson that I've had to get hit with 500 times and will almost certainly have to be hit with many more times is the reminder that I cannot control the behavior of a single other human being on this planet. Nobody can. The only person whose behavior I can control is my own. And whenever I'm facing friction with someone, whenever any of us is facing friction with someone, there is an incredible seduction to focus on what the other person is doing wrong. It's unbelievably tempting when we're facing a challenge with someone to be focused on, can you believe they did this and they said this and how could they and why would they think that way and why would they act that way? And it's really comforting to focus on what the other person has done wrong. And the lesson in resilience that I got again this year was, okay, they're behaving how they're behaving. Why am I responding like this? Why do I care? What's my role in this? What can I change in my own reaction, in the way that I'm showing up? And what I find consistently is that if my focus is on my own behavior and making sure I've got my own house in order and that I'm showing up the way that to model the kind of behavior I want to see in others, that is the absolute way to go to create a positive outcome. And if I don't focus on that, then I never get anywhere. So huge lesson for me. Thank you so much for that question.